Have you ever smiled so hard that no one noticed your heart quietly falling apart? Because that's exactly what happened to me. The happiest day of my life became the day I finally understood that some people don't need to shout to humiliate you. Sometimes, they simply make sure you don't belong. The applause echoed through the grand ballroom as my husband and I stepped inside for the first time as a married couple. Golden chandeliers bathed the room in warm light. Fresh white roses covered every table. A live orchestra filled the air with soft music while photographers rushed from one side of the hall to the other, capturing every smile. Guests rose to their feet. Phones were lifted. Champagne glasses clinked together. From the outside, everything looked perfect. I smiled because every bride is expected to. But deep inside, I was searching for two familiar faces. My parents. My father never missed an important day in my life. Not my graduation, not my first job, not the tiny birthday dinners we could barely afford when I was growing up. He always found a way to be there, so why couldn't I see him now? I glanced toward the front tables. Nothing. The family section was overflowing with my husband's relatives. His uncles laughed loudly. His cousins posed for photographs. His aunts chatted as though they owned the celebration. I looked again. Still no sign of my parents. Maybe they were speaking with someone outside. Maybe the photographer had pulled them away. Maybe they were freshening up. I kept convincing myself there had to be a simple explanation. Then, while everyone admired the decorations, my eyes wandered toward the back of the ballroom. And there they were. My father stood quietly against the wall, still holding the beautifully wrapped wedding gift he had insisted on bringing himself. Beside him, my mother clasped her purse with both hands, forcing the kind of smile only a mother can manage when she's trying to hide her pain from her child. Neither of them had a chair. Not one. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. Someone would notice. Someone would fix it. Any second now. Except, no one moved. Servers walked past them. Guests squeezed by without a second glance. Even the wedding coordinator continued greeting people as if everything was unfolding exactly as planned. I searched for my husband. He was only a few steps away. Our eyes met. For a brief moment, I waited for him to react, to wave over a staff member, to offer his own seat, to do something. Instead, he looked away. That single glance told me more than words ever could. This wasn't an oversight. Someone had decided my parents didn't deserve a place at their daughter's wedding. And the people who knew had chosen silence. My chest tightened. My bouquet suddenly felt heavier than it had all day. The music kept playing. People kept laughing. The celebration continued. Yet all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I took one slow breath, then another. I looked toward the stage where the master of ceremonies was preparing to welcome everyone. Just a few steps away rested the microphone. I started walking. But before I tell you why I reached for it, you need to know how a wedding built on love slowly became a stage for quiet cruelty. Because this story didn't begin at the reception. It started 8 months earlier, the first time I walked into my future mother-in-law's home. 8 months earlier. If anyone had asked me to describe Daniel's family, I would have called them a blessing, especially his mother. The first time I visited their home, she wrapped me in a warm embrace before I had even crossed the doorway. "Oh, so this is the beautiful woman who stole my son's heart," she said with a smile. "Welcome home, my daughter." I remember laughing. She made me feel seen. She complimented my dress, insisted I eat more than everyone else, and proudly introduced me to every relative who walked through the living room. By the time we left that evening, Daniel squeezed my hand and asked, "So, what do you think?" I smiled. "I think your family is wonderful." He grinned. "I told you she'd love you." Looking back now, I wasn't wrong. She did like me, as long as I stayed within the role she'd already imagined for me. At the time, though, I couldn't see that. Neither could anyone else. A month later, Daniel proposed. It wasn't extravagant. No cameras, no flash mob. Just the two of us at the small lakeside cafe where we'd had our first date. He reached into his pocket with trembling hands. "I don't have perfect words," he admitted. "But I know I don't want to spend another day imagining life without you." By the time he opened the ring box, I was already crying. "Yes," I whispered, before he could even finish the question. For a while, life felt wonderfully simple. Our families celebrated together. Friends filled our phones with congratulations. Every conversation revolved around flowers, cakes, venues, and honeymoon destinations. It was everything I'd dreamed of. Then Daniel suggested something that sounded perfectly reasonable. "Mom loves planning events," he said one evening. "She'll probably want to help." "That would be nice," I replied. "And it'll take some pressure off us." I nodded without hesitation. I had no reason to refuse. The following Saturday, we gathered around her dining table with notebooks, fabric samples, and cups of steaming tea. She clapped her hands excitedly. "This is going to be the wedding everyone talks about for years." Everyone laughed, including me. She flipped open a planner she'd already prepared. "I've made a few suggestions," she said casually. The word few should have warned me. Within 20 minutes, she'd presented a complete vision. The color palette, the venue, the guest list, the menu, even the music. Every detail had been carefully outlined before she'd asked what either of us wanted. I glanced at Daniel, expecting him to speak. Instead, he smiled. "Mom's always been organized." She looked at me warmly. "Of course, sweetheart. If there's anything you don't like, just tell me." Her voice was gentle, her expression was kind. Yet somehow, every suggestion I made was met with a polite reason it wouldn't work. "I think ivory would look prettier than champagne. I know a better photographer. That venue is far more elegant. Trust me on this." By the end of the afternoon, the wedding already felt less like ours. Still, I convinced myself I was overthinking. After all, she wasn't being rude. She wasn't insulting me. She simply seemed certain. And certainty can be surprisingly persuasive when it's wrapped in kindness. As we drove home, I rested my head against the window. "Your mom really has everything planned," I said. Daniel chuckled. "That's just who she is. You don't think she's taking over a little?" He shrugged. "She's excited. Try not to read too much into it." I let the conversation go. Sometimes love convinces you that peace is more valuable than being heard. I had no idea how expensive that peace would become. Because over the next few weeks, my future mother-in-law didn't just help plan the wedding. She slowly began deciding who mattered and who didn't. If someone had asked me when everything started going wrong, I wouldn't have been able to give them an exact date. There wasn't a dramatic argument, no shouting, no slammed doors. Just a series of tiny decisions, each one so easy to excuse, until they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. It began with the venue. Daniel and I had fallen in love with a charming garden estate just outside the city. It wasn't the biggest place we'd visited, but it felt peaceful. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. The lake reflected the afternoon sun. When we stood there together, I could already picture myself walking down the aisle. "We found the one," I told him. He smiled. "I think so too." 3 days later, his mother called. "I've found somewhere even better," she announced. She invited us to tour a luxurious hotel ballroom across town. The moment we walked inside, she spread her arms proudly. "Now this," she said, "looks like a proper wedding." The ballroom was breathtaking. Tall ceilings, crystal chandeliers, marble floors polished until they gleamed. It was beautiful, but it didn't feel like us. I quietly reminded Daniel about the garden. Before he could answer, his mother gently touched my arm. "Sweetheart, your wedding only happens once. Why settle for ordinary when it can be unforgettable?" The room fell silent. I looked at Daniel. He hesitated. Then came the sentence I would hear again and again. "I think Mom has a point." So we changed the venue. I told myself it wasn't worth arguing over. After all, a marriage mattered more than a location. A week later, another discussion unfolded. This time, it was the guest list. Daniel and I had agreed on a modest celebration. Close relatives, a few dear friends, the people who had truly been part of our journey. Then his mother arrived carrying a notebook. "I've added a few names," she said cheerfully. A few turned out to be nearly 60. Business associates, distant cousins, neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years, friends from church, former colleagues, people I'd never met. I stared at the pages in disbelief. "Won't that be too many?" I asked carefully. She smiled as though I'd asked an innocent question. "Oh, darling, these people watched Daniel grow up. They'd be heartbroken if they weren't invited." I glanced at our budget. The numbers no longer made sense. To accommodate the extra guests, sacrifices had to be made. The premium photographer became a standard package. The honeymoon was shortened. Even the dessert table was reduced. Every adjustment seemed to benefit one side of the family. Still, Daniel avoided confrontation. "They're only invitations," he said. "It's not a big deal." Maybe he believed that. Maybe he simply didn't want conflict. Either way, his silence kept giving every decision permission to continue. Meanwhile, my parents never demanded anything. Whenever I called my mother, she'd ask only one question. "Are you happy?" Not, "How much are we spending?" Not, "Who gets invited?" Just, "Are you happy?" I always answered yes, even on the days I wasn't completely sure. My father was quietly preparing his own surprise. One evening, he invited me to their house. "I have something for you." He disappeared into the bedroom before returning with a small wooden box. Inside lay a delicate gold bracelet. Simple, elegant, timeless. "I've been putting money aside for this since the day you finished university," he said softly. I looked at him, stunned. "Dad, you didn't have to." He smiled. "I know. But every father dreams of giving his daughter something she'll remember." Tears blurred my vision. I hugged him tightly. In that moment, I realized the bracelet wasn't expensive because of the gold. It was valuable because of everything he'd quietly gone without to afford it. He'd skipped replacing his old phone, delayed repairing the leaking roof, worked extra weekends, all without saying a word. Not because anyone asked him to, because loving me had always been enough. Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about my parents. They never tried to control the wedding. They never insisted on being recognized. They simply wanted to celebrate with me. The contrast between both families became harder to ignore. One offered opinions at every opportunity. The other offered unconditional support. Then came the meeting that changed everything. The wedding planner invited us to review the final reception layout. Table placements, entrance order, family seating, every last detail. As she unfolded the large printed chart across the conference table, something caught my attention almost immediately. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I leaned closer, my heart skipped a beat. My parents' names weren't where they were supposed to be. I traced my finger across the seating chart, hoping I had simply looked in the wrong place. The bridal party table was exactly where it should be. Daniel's parents were seated directly beside us. His grandparents had an entire reserved section. Even relatives traveling from overseas had been given premium seats near the stage. Then I found my parents' names. Table 14, near the back of the ballroom, partially hidden behind a large floral display. For a second, I couldn't find my voice. "There must be a mistake," I finally said. The wedding planner looked down at the chart. Before she could answer, Daniel's mother leaned forward with a reassuring smile. "Oh, don't worry about that." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "It's only a working draft," she replied smoothly. "These things change all the time." The planner gave a small nod. "Yes, we're still making adjustments." I exhaled, trying to relax. "Could we move my parents closer to the front?" "Of course," the planner said. But before she reached for her pen, my future mother-in-law spoke again. "We'll review everything after the final guest confirmations." She turned to me with that same pleasant expression I'd come to know so well. "I promise we'll make sure everyone is comfortable." Everyone. Such a simple word. Yet somehow it never seemed to include my family. As we left the meeting, I slowed my pace until Daniel caught up. "Did that bother you?" I asked. He looked puzzled. "What? The seating?" He slipped his hands into his pockets. "I thought your parents would be closer." "So did I." He shrugged lightly. "It'll probably be sorted out before the wedding." "You really think so?" He kissed my forehead. "I don't want you stressing over something that hasn't even happened yet." I wanted to believe him. I truly did. So I buried the uneasy feeling and focused on everything else that still needed attention. Dress fittings, cake tasting, invitations, music rehearsals. Each task kept me busy enough to ignore the questions lingering in the back of my mind. A week before the wedding, my mother called. "I hope we're not forgetting anything," she said cheerfully. I smiled. "You've already done more than enough." She laughed. "I've ironed your father's suit 3 times. You know he'll wrinkle it the moment he sits down." "He probably will." We both laughed. Then she lowered her voice. "He's been practicing his speech." I frowned. "Speech?" "He wants to thank your husband for loving you." I closed my eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like my father. Always thinking about making other people feel appreciated. Never expecting anything in return. The night before the wedding, he called me himself. His voice carried the same calm warmth I'd known since childhood. My princess, I smiled instantly. You still call me that. You'll always be my little girl. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then he cleared his throat. I know tomorrow will be busy. It will. So if you don't get a chance to see your mother and me right away, don't worry about us. We'll understand. Something about those words settled heavily in my chest. Dad, you know I could never forget you. I know, he replied gently. I just don't want you worrying about anything except being happy. After we hung up, I sat in silence. Why did his words feel like a goodbye instead of reassurance? The next morning arrived in a blur of excitement. Hairstylists rushed from chair to chair. Makeup artists unpacked brushes and palettes. Bridesmaids laughed while trying not to cry. Music drifted through the bridal suite. For a few precious hours, everything felt exactly as I'd imagined. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from the wedding coordinator. Kindly ask your parents to arrive 45 minutes earlier than everyone else for family logistics. I frowned. That seemed unusual. I called immediately. Hi, did they explain why? Oh, she replied politely. It's simply to make guest flow easier. Nothing to worry about. I thanked her and ended the call. When I told Daniel, he barely looked up from adjusting his tie. If that's what they need, it's fine. I nodded. It sounded reasonable. Besides, my parents had never complained about being early for anything. If someone asked them to arrive at sunrise for my wedding, they probably would. So I called my father. Dad, yes, my princess. They'd like you and Mom to come a little earlier. No problem. Are you sure? He chuckled. We've been waiting for this day your entire life. What's another 45 minutes? I laughed with him, completely unaware that those extra minutes would become part of a plan neither of us could see. Because while I was preparing to walk down the aisle, someone else was quietly deciding exactly where my parents belonged. The church ceremony was beautiful. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, scattering colors across the aisle. A string quartet played softly as guests settled into their seats. When the doors opened and I stepped inside with my father, every anxious thought seemed to disappear. For those few minutes, nothing else mattered. Not the endless planning, not the compromises, not the quiet disagreements that had followed us for months. All I could see was the man beside me. His arm was steady. His smile was gentle. Every few steps, he glanced at me with the same expression he wore on my first day of school. The day I graduated, the day I got my first job. Pride, pure and unconditional. As we reached the altar, he squeezed my hand. So this is it, he whispered. I nodded, fighting back tears. This is it. Instead of letting go immediately, he paused for the briefest moment. You look exactly like your mother did when I first saw her. I laughed through watery eyes. Now you're trying to make me cry. I've been trying not to cry since this morning. The guest chuckled softly as he kissed my forehead before placing my hand into Daniel's. For a while, everything felt perfect again. We exchanged our vows, promised to stand beside one another through every season of life. Family and friends applauded as we shared our first kiss as husband and wife. When we walked back down the aisle together, I truly believed the difficult part was behind us. I had no idea. The real heartbreak hadn't even begun. The reception venue looked even more breathtaking than I remembered. Golden candlelight reflected against towering floral arrangements. Soft music floated through the ballroom while waiters welcomed arriving guests with sparkling drinks. Our photographer immediately gathered everyone for family portraits. Let's start with the groom's family. Daniel's relatives surrounded us within seconds. His parents, grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles. The room buzzed with laughter. Flash after flash lit the cameras. Then the photographer smiled. Wonderful. Now let's have the bride's family. I turned instinctively. Only, they weren't there. I scanned the entrance. Nothing. Near the staircase? Nothing. Outside the glass doors? Still nothing. The photographer waited politely. Take your time. I looked at my maid of honor. Have you seen my parents? She shook her head. I thought they were with you. Daniel checked his watch. They're probably talking to someone. Maybe. That sounded reasonable. My father knew so many people from church. Perhaps he'd been stopped by an old friend. The photographer moved on to another group while we waited. 5 minutes became 10, then 15. Guests began taking their seats for dinner. Still, no sign of them. A quiet knot formed in my stomach. I excused myself. "I'll be right back." Without waiting for anyone to answer, I walked toward the reception hall. The closer I came, the louder the voices became. Laughter, conversations, clinking cutlery. Everything sounded wonderfully alive. Until I stepped inside. My eyes swept across the room. The front tables were filled. Daniel's family occupied nearly every reserved seat. His mother moved confidently from one guest to another, greeting everyone with effortless charm. She looked completely at ease. Almost too at ease. I searched the middle rows. Then the far end of the ballroom. My breathing slowed. Where were they? Had they gone home? Were they feeling unwell? Had something happened? 100 possibilities rushed through my mind. Then, movement near the back wall caught my attention. 2 familiar figures stood quietly beside a decorative pillar. My father still held the carefully wrapped gift he'd refused to leave in the car because he wanted to place it in my hands himself. My mother rested one hand lightly on his arm. Neither of them was eating. Neither had a place at any table. They weren't waiting for someone. They had nowhere to sit. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The ballroom around me faded into a blur. Music continued. Conversations carried on. Servers walked past without hesitation. No one seemed to notice the elderly couple standing alone at their own daughter's wedding. Or perhaps they had noticed and decided it wasn't their concern. My father caught sight of me. The moment our eyes met, he straightened his shoulders and smiled. Not because he was happy, because he didn't want me to worry. Then he gave me a small wave, as though everything was perfectly fine. That smile hurt more than if he'd cried. I started walking toward them, slowly, carefully, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. There had to be, because surely, no one would deliberately leave the bride's parents standing while everyone else enjoyed the celebration. Would they? I stopped a few steps away. For reasons I still can't explain, I didn't call out to them. I simply stood there, hidden behind one of the towering flower arrangements, watching the 2 people who had spent their lives putting me first. A young waiter approached them carrying a tray of drinks. "Sir, ma'am, would you like something to drink?" My father smiled politely. "No, thank you." The waiter hesitated. "Would you like me to help you find your table?" Before he could finish, another member of staff walked over and whispered something in his ear. The young man's expression changed instantly. He gave an awkward nod. I'm sorry." Then he walked away. My mother watched him leave before quietly looking at my father. "They've probably made a mistake." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't believe it. "I'm sure they'll sort it out." Neither of them sounded convinced. Even so, they refused to complain. A moment later, an elderly woman from our church recognized them. "Oh, Brother Samuel," she said warmly. "I was looking for you during the family photographs." My father forced another smile. "We must have missed the call." She glanced around. "Where are your seats?" Before either of my parents could answer, one of Daniel's aunts stepped in with a bright laugh. "Oh, there's been a little reshuffle. Everything's under control." The church member looked uncertain. "If you say so." She walked away. Daniel's aunt didn't even look at my parents again. She simply adjusted her necklace and returned to her table as though she'd solved a minor inconvenience. That was the moment the last piece fell into place. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't poor organization. People knew. They had simply accepted it. My fingers tightened around my bouquet until the stems pressed into my palm. I searched the room for Daniel. He was chatting with 2 business associates near the stage. Calm, relaxed, completely unaware that I had witnessed everything. Or perhaps, he assumed I never would. I walked toward him. "Daniel." He turned with an easy smile. "There you are." I kept my voice steady. "Have you seen my parents?" His smile faded just enough for me to notice. "They're here somewhere." "I know they're here." I held his gaze. "Why are they standing?" For a brief second, he said nothing. Then came the answer I wasn't prepared for. There weren't enough seats at the front. I stared at him. "What?" He rubbed the back of his neck. My mom said some last-minute guests had to be accommodated. I waited. Surely there was more. Surely he was about to tell me he'd fix it. Instead, he quietly added, "I didn't think it would become such a big issue." Those words landed harder than any insult ever could. Not a big issue? The man who had walked me down the aisle, the woman who had prayed over me every night since childhood, were standing against a wall at their only daughter's wedding, and my husband thought it wasn't important enough to address. I looked around the ballroom. There were empty handbags resting on chairs. Children occupying places meant for adults. Solutions were everywhere. Compassion simply wasn't. I turned away before he could say another word. Each step toward my parents felt heavier than the last. As I drew closer, I heard my mother speak in a voice so soft it almost disappeared beneath the music. My feet are starting to ache. My father shifted the gift box into his other hand. I'm sorry. She smiled gently. Why are you apologizing? I should have asked someone. You didn't want to embarrass her. He lowered his eyes. I promised myself today would be perfect for our daughter. It still is, my mother whispered. We're here. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. No. His voice cracked. It would have been perfect if she'd never had to choose between us and keeping the peace. The words stole the air from my lungs. He wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding respect. He was worried about me. After everything, he was still protecting my happiness. A tear slipped down my mother's cheek. She quickly wiped it away before anyone noticed. Then she reached for my father's hand. We'll stand. It's only for one evening. He gave a faint nod. If this keeps her smiling, I can stand all night. That was it. No outrage, no scene. Just two loving parents quietly accepting a humiliation they never deserved because they refused to become a burden on the happiest day of their daughter's life. Something inside me shifted. For months, I had chosen patience, compromise, understanding. I told myself harmony required sacrifice. I kept waiting for someone else to do the right thing. Daniel, his mother, the wedding planner, anyone. No one did. Which meant, it was finally my turn. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced cheerfully, before dinner is served, our beautiful bride would like to share a few words. Guests applauded. They expected a heartfelt thank you, a funny story, perhaps a romantic toast. I slowly placed my bouquet on the nearest table, smoothed the front of my dress, lifted my chin. Then I began walking toward the stage. For the first time that entire day, I wasn't worried about causing discomfort. I was only concerned with doing what should have been done from the very beginning. Just before I reached the stage, I turned back one last time. My parents were exactly where I'd left them, still standing, still pretending everything was all right. My father noticed me looking and gave me another reassuring smile. He thought I was coming over to comfort them. Instead, I walked past. Straight toward the microphone. The master of ceremonies greeted me with a cheerful grin. Our beautiful bride has a few words she'd like to share. He handed me the microphone without the slightest idea what was about to happen. The ballroom fell silent. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. I took a slow breath. Then I smiled. I want to begin by thanking every single person who took the time to celebrate with us today. Warm applause filled the room. I waited for it to fade. There are so many people who helped make this day possible. Another round of nods. Then my voice softened. But before dinner is served, I need to recognize two people who haven't been recognized at all. A few guests exchanged curious glances. I slowly raised my hand and pointed toward the back of the ballroom. My parents. Every head turned at once. The room became so quiet that even the orchestra stopped playing. My father worked extra shifts so I could stay in school. My mother sacrificed countless dreams to make sure I could chase mine. They taught me kindness. They taught me integrity. And they taught me that a person's worth is never measured by money. My voice trembled. But somehow, today, the two people who sacrificed the most for me were left standing at my own wedding. A ripple of whispers swept across the ballroom. Some guests twisted around in disbelief. Others looked toward the reserved tables. Only then did many of them realize what had happened. I turned toward the event staff. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for basic respect. If there isn't room beside me for the people who gave me life, then those seats never belonged to anyone else. No one moved. For one painfully long second, the silence felt endless. Then an elderly gentleman stood up. You can have my seat. Another guest followed. So can mine. Within moments, Chairs began sliding across the ballroom. People willingly stood so my parents could sit. Several guests even applauded. My father looked completely overwhelmed. He shook his head. No. No. Please don't inconvenience yourselves. I walked down from the stage, took his hand. You've spent your whole life making sacrifices for me. This time, please let me honor you. His eyes filled with tears. So did mine. When he finally sat beside my mother, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. Not because of me, because everyone understood. They had just witnessed something that should never have happened. I turned toward Daniel. He couldn't meet my eyes. His shoulders were slumped. The confidence he'd carried all day had vanished. I should have stopped this, he whispered. Yes. That single word carried every disappointment I'd swallowed over the past 8 months. It was never about the chairs. It was about choosing what was right when it would have been easier to stay quiet. He lowered his head. There was nothing left to say. As for my mother-in-law, for the first time since I'd met her, she had no explanation, no carefully chosen words, no polished smile. Only silence. The kind she'd expected from everyone else. The reception continued. The food was served. People laughed again. But something had changed. Not because I embarrassed anyone, because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Later that evening, my father hugged me tightly before we left. I'm sorry today became so difficult. I rested my head on his shoulder and smiled through my tears. No, Dad. I'm sorry I almost let you believe you had to stand alone. He kissed my forehead the same way he had before walking me down the aisle. My little girl, you've always stood up for what's right. I smiled. No. I learned that from you. Sometimes people believe love is proven through extravagant weddings, expensive decorations, or flawless photographs. But I learned something far more valuable that day. A family's character isn't revealed by where they choose to sit. It's revealed by who they're willing to leave standing. And if I had to relive my wedding all over again, I'd still grab that microphone, every single time.